This is a special broadcast because, folks, this is what is affecting us right now as a nation. This is what's going on. And so tonight I've brought in two authors, Benjamin Baruch and Jeffrey R. Nyquist, to talk about their books, The New Tactics of Global War. In 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War, an event described in the West as the end of history. Post-Soviet Russia embraced free markets and the democratic elections, and also the United States began to view the new Russia as an ally and a friend. In 2014, Russian forces clandestinely invaded Ukraine and then annexed Crimea, and the world suddenly woke up to realize the Russian bear was back after a long hibernation. The West had hoped their Cold War adversary would develop a consumer-based economy and become a peaceful member of the Society of Nations. But instead, Russia spent a decade arming itself to the teeth with an entirely new class of superweapons, conventional as well as nuclear. The early reports of the demise of the Soviet leadership and the end of communist threat now appear at best greatly exaggerated and at worst an intentional deception. Although the intelligence service of the Soviet era, the KGB, was renamed the Federal Security Service, its Russian acronym FSB, it facilitated the rise of President Vladimir Putin to power, himself a former KGB official, proving the security service from the former Russia era was still very much in power within the new Russia. The New Tactics of Global War exposes what really happened with Russia and why in the decade ahead it remains the number one existential threat to the United States. Reality is a very stubborn thing. It does not care that no one is listening, and it will not just simply go away because we wish it would. The New Tactics of Global War unveils the reality of the changing balance of power in the world and provides insight into the mind of Russian strategists who first began this chess game of lies and deception almost 100 years ago. The authors expose their stealth moves, one lie at a time, allowing the reader to understand the minds of the men who played this evil game, and in so doing, to look within the mind of the beast. And behold, a second beast like a bear, and it raised itself up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. Daniel chapter 7, verse 5. Well, tonight's program is titled The Road to World War III. And with that, I am going to bring on our guest tonight, Brother Benjamin Baruch. You've been familiar with Benjamin. He has written the book, The Day of the Lord is at Hand, and also 3 other books he has produced on Search the Scriptures. And also, as I mentioned earlier, Jeffrey R. Nyquist. He's the author of The Origins of the Fourth World War. He has served as a contributing editor to Dispatch Magazine, WorldNet Daily, Newsmax, and the Sierra Times, and for 12 years wrote for the Financial Sense Online. He is also a senior fellow of the Political Science in the Inter-American Institute. And with that, I'm going to bring him on right now. Brother Benjamin and Brother Jeff, are you there with us this evening?
Right here.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Frank.
All right. Amen. Thank you all for joining us here and just sharing the back page of the book, The New Tactics of Global War. Are we really headed towards World War III? And if we are, how soon could this actually happen?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, it could happen next year. It could be the year after, but it's coming within the near term. You know, it's probably coming within the next 4 or 5 years at the outside, but it could be coming at us very quickly here in the next year or two.
Well, Jeff, you and I we spent years talking about this subject, and together we've actually published a book which deals with the changing balance of power. Most Americans, most of our listeners, are not really aware of the level of commitment the Russian government, the Russian military, the entire Russian economic system is really organized around one central principle, and it's not shopping, which is the principle around which the United States is organized, but it's projecting military power. And you know, how real is the threat? Maybe we should start there. How significant is the threat of war with Russia, China, and their satellite communist or Arab powers?
Well, Chinese and Russian leaders have been saying in recent years, they've been saying that war is coming. As far back as 2005, the Chinese defense minister said that war with the United States was probably coming in 10 years, around 2015. Now we're 2 years past that. That was Chi Haoqian. He was one of the senior leaders of the Chinese military commission and the Chinese defense minister. You have leaders in the Russian government, generals and others, have been talking about war with the United States. You have the leader of North Korea, of course, that's allied with Russia and China. You've got Chinese generals have been talking about it. Chinese newspapers, the Chinese People's Daily, has said that Chinese should get ready for war, that wars with the United States is very possible. And of course, the Russians, they and the Chinese both started their war preparations. Were practically beginning just a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I know that many people are going to find this difficult to believe, but I gave a presentation in Washington in March of 1999 to a group of people connected to the U.S. government, people who had held posts in the CIA and State Department and other agencies. And I gave that presentation with a Russian defector named Colonel Stanislav Lunev. And it was Lunev that made the point when one of the CIA people there objected to, surely the Russians don't want a war with us, they want to have shopping malls like we've got. And Lunev looked at him and said, "Are you a normal person?" Of course, he was a CIA official, so he didn't think he was a normal person. Maybe he thought he was James Bond, and he was kind of confused, and Lunev said, "Well, you look like a normal person." And he said, "I want to tell you that in my 30-something years in the Russian and Soviet military, we trained for one mission and one mission only, future nuclear world war against America." And you could drop a pin. Everybody was just stunned at this.
We just simply don't want to believe that, do we?
No. And he defected after the fall of the Soviet Union, and he said, "Look, the Russians. This is a continuous state. The Russians are doing the same thing. They're preparing the same way." He pointed out that they even kept the military districts, that they kept the generals. He made a statement the first time I had a debriefing with him. He talked about how there was something like 1,600 Russian generals, many more than they needed, and he said, "Well, the reason for that is it takes 2 years to train a division commander who's a general. But it takes only 8 weeks to train a soldier." And that was his explanation. They need the generals because they need to put the Soviet military back together as quickly as they can. They need to bring these forces together. And, of course, what we've seen over the last 20 years is Russia in the late 90s developing a new generation of weapons, which they tested in the Chechen War, and then setting up the factories, getting investment from the West, getting their heavy industry infrastructure rebuilt from the ground up, and then starting around 2008 or so, actually before that, a little bit before that, starting to have an ever-increasing military production of these new weapons, and to bring out one new weapon system after another, while the United States is completely not doing any of this. We're talking about weapon systems we developed in the 50s, like the B-52, and the 60s, like the Minuteman III. You know, those weapons have undergone improvements, but they are basically those weapons. That's where they come from. And we have not been modernizing our forces. We've been fighting terrorists. We've been fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these are not enemies like the Russians or Chinese. These are not major combatants. We're basically fighting a kind of guerrilla war against irregular forces that requires mainly light mobile forces, which would not be suitable for fighting a war. You know, the Russians are putting together Guards tank armies. You know, you can't fly in with a bunch of light infantry and helicopters and beat a bunch of, heavy tank brigades. You can't do it. And that's nothing compared to the way we've allowed our nuclear arsenal to rot away. Now, Obama basically held back on the fixing the problems with our nuclear arsenal for most of his 2 terms. I mean, Obama was responsible for a lot of this, but also the fact that the American people were asleep. In the 2012 election, when the Republican candidate mentioned Russia as a potential enemy, as a real threat to the United States. He was mocked by President Obama in that election. And
it's truly delusional thinking, because the state of readiness of our forces is abysmal. As you mentioned, our air power, our primary bomber fleet is the B-52, which was built in the 1950s. These are 60 to 70-year-old planes that are flying around.
Well, these are very old airframes, and of course the Russians have been building up and modernizing their forces, modernizing their doctrine. We have, with Trump being elected, we may be saved by the skin of our teeth, because he did something Obama wasn't going to do with their sequester cuts. They were not allowed. Their military couldn't train, couldn't keep the fighter planes, functioning, couldn't keep the carrier crews trained. So the levels of training in the Navy, in the Air Force, were not what they had been. And these are very serious deficits. And, of course, the United States, the other countries of the world, many of the free countries in the free world depend on the U.S. military to defend them. They can't. A country like Japan cannot defend itself alone against China. South Korea cannot defend itself alone against North Korea, China, and Russia. And it's the same thing with NATO. Russia would plow through NATO if the U.S. didn't have its divisions and Air Force units and naval units. The Russians would just plow them under in no time at all. The Chinese and Russians would own the world if the United States was not on guard.
It's simply amazing.
It's a simple reality.
Jeff, in terms of conventional war, we face a formidable alliance. In terms of global nuclear war, what level of missile defense does the U.S. have compared to the missile defense of Russia?
Well, the approximate numbers right now, this is kind of shocking. When George Bush backed out of the ABM treaty, we started to set up anti-ballistic missile launchers in Alaska, and we've got some in California here, where I am. And it's somewhere in the range of 12 to 16 launchers in California and 50 to 60 launchers in Alaska. I don't, the numbers, they fluctuate, but those have been the way the numbers have worked for many years. And it's been stated publicly that these ABMs cannot stop a Russian missile. Russian missiles are too advanced and move too fast for this ABM system to affect them.
And if we have 75 or so interceptors, we certainly couldn't stop several hundred missiles.
Oh, no, it can't do that. And now the Russians, this Bill Lee was the expert on this. He passed away some years back, and I did have a chance to meet him in the 1990s. He'd worked for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he wrote a very important book called The ABM Treaty Charade, which came out in 1997, in which he pointed out that the Russians had always been violating the ABM treaty. They had 10 to 12,000 dual-purpose surface-to-air missile ABMs. These are the S-300, S-400 systems. To explain how this works, we've been sold this idea of hitting a missile with a missile. You get these things that are moving Mach, 3, 4, whatever it is, coming at each other, and you got to hit a missile with a missile. That's crazy. The Russians, they tested a system in the early 1960s in which you send a missile up with a nuclear warhead on it, and it only has to get, a few kilometers away from the target. And if it has an X-ray radiation or a neutron radiation, it can be further away than that. If it's in outer space, direct line of sight, it can be, as I understand it, more than 100 kilometers away. And it could knock out a whole cloud of incoming warheads fired from the United States with an X-ray radiation warhead. So they have this system, and they have nuclear weapons, a whole independent nuclear stockpile just for their ABM system, so that they're shooting down a nuclear weapon with a nuclear weapon. And I had heard about the U.S. was planning to build such a system in the 1960s itself, but we never did. And part of it had to do with the Vietnam War and where the money went, but the other part of it was the rising environmentalist lobby. What Bill Lee told me was that they said, look, we're going to blow holes in the ozone. I mean, you're going to have a nuclear war, right? You're going to be blown up in your homes and wiped out, the whole country wiped out, and you're worried about a few holes in the ozone, which is, by the way, nonsense because O3 is manufactured by the sunlight striking the upper atmosphere. It's constantly being manufactured. So you don't have to really worry about that. But this canard was raised to prevent us from being able to build these weapons, this defense system, which the Russians have had for decades. And now the Russians are building state-of-the-art S-500 ABMs. These things are, they're building 2,500 of them. They're much more effective than the S-400. They can even shoot down cruise missiles. And they're based on the same principle, using neutron and X-ray radiation warheads. Just imagine the Russians having thousands of interceptors, us having 75 or 80, whatever our number is at any given time. This is just not acceptable. This is so. If people want to understand the complexities of the military balance, look, one of the biggest nuclear war expert at the CIA was Peter Vincent Pry back when the Office of Soviet Analysis was running back in the early 90s. He wrote a book in 1990 called Nuclear Wars, Exchanges and Outcomes, in which he said, well, if we do this, START 3 treaty or, all these START treaties, and we end up in this position where we're less than 2,000 warheads. And then he says, and then we get down below that, which is where we are now. He said, we're in a position where they can win a nuclear war. I mean, this is what Pry said in 1990. Now we're here, And I've known Pry for years, and kind of the thing he jokes is he says, well, he's kind of surprised to wake up every morning,
Yeah, we've lasted this long.
That we've lasted this long. It's the irresponsibility of our leaders, especially the Obama administration, but the George W. Bush administration, being over-focused on this war on terror, which we should talk about where that came from and how this relates to Soviet strategy, because the Cold War never ended. And the Russians, when people are talking about war with Russia, I want to make the point that, Putin is still a communist. This is my analysis, that he's still a communist. And I can give you strong arguments, proofs, why he's still a communist, why the Cold War never ended. For example, Lenin, who was against nationalism, against Christianity, he was one of the biggest enemies of Christianity of the 20th century, and was against nationalism. He hated Russia, great Russian nationalism. He was a communist. He was the founder of the Soviet Union, founder of the first communist state on the planet. Did you know that he's lying at the heart of Moscow in a glass case on display? They haven't buried him. Putin will not bury Lenin.
He's
right?
the father of the revolution.
Well, yes, and here's the other thing. No matter how Putin tries to fool people that he's a Christian, that he's a nationalist, or this or that, Putin last October really gave himself away. There was this was the 100th year celebration this year of the Bolshevik Revolution. Back, I think it was November 7th of the, last November 7th. But they had this International Youth and Students Conference, this giant communist youth organization, right? It meets every couple of years, every 3-4 years. It has been meeting, and it typically meets in communist countries because these are communist youth. There were 30,000 of them. They came to Sochi, Russia, and guess who the keynote speaker at this giant communist gathering was? Putin, Vladimir Putin. And you can go online, you can watch his speech. It's got English subtitles. He basically tells them that he thinks they're great. He believes in them. They should go for it. He literally says, go for it, and I'm behind you. Now, this is a global communist youth organization. And there's Vladimir Putin saying, I believe in you. I believe in what you believe in. I want you to go for it. Have faith. Build your new future. That is your communist future. That's pretty much saying who he is. But there's been many things like this to show that Putin is really a communist. When Putin first went to Cuba, communist Cuba, in I think it was December of 2000, he had a press conference, and there were Cuban journalists there. Of course, Cuban journalists are DGI agents. Many of them. It's a controlled press. They're Communist Party people. And one of them asked Putin, "Are you left wing or right wing?" and Putin said, as for what people say I am, he said, we have a saying in Russia. He said, call me a pot, but don't put me in the oven, or one translation would be, call me a pot, but heat me not. And this was Putin's way of telling them, look, I'm not going to admit that I'm a communist here. We're playing a game here, and I'm pretending not to be one.
Right.
So amongst yourselves, you can say, oh, yeah, he's a communist, he's a good communist, but don't put the heat on me to say what I am.
Well, I think it's a given that the communists are, in fact, still the Reds and the communists. Jeff, we've got about 30 minutes left in the program. Let's talk about the pre-war period, the Great Terror, the overture, the use of terrorist elements to distract the West and draw them into a war, chasing people around mountains, and then ultimately the scandal and the political fallout of the end of the overture period, and how close are we to all of these communist pre-war preparations being completed?
Well, in the defector literature, we were told by writers like Jan Shana, Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer, and Viktor Suvorov, who's the pen name of the GRU defector Vladimir Rezin. We have been told by these men in their books things to watch for in advance of World War III, especially with Viktor Suvorov. Viktor Suvorov wrote a very important book in 1987 called Spetsnaz, and it's a chapter in that book called Spetsnaz's First World War, in which he describes the period before World War III, as understood by the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, or Soviet General Staff. And it's very amazing that it matches up perfectly with what we've experienced since 9/11. First, he says, the beginning of the overture is something called Grey Terror. Grey Terror, he says, quote, is a period in which the West comes under attack by terrorist forces that have no apparent connection to Moscow. But he said they will be controlled by Moscow through secret intermediaries, and they will be mercenaries through those intermediaries. That's what he says. And he says the purpose of the overture, the purpose of this Great Terror, is to divert the intelligence and military resources of the West away from Russia and its bloc of countries to this new enemy, this terrorist enemy, and to completely blind them. As far as, all your intelligence and your satellites and everything is now watching, Afghanistan and Iraq and looking for bin Laden and trying to stop terrorist attacks, trying to stop the spread of the terrorist cells in Africa and the Middle East and Asia and now Europe. So and then he says, so this is what's going to occupy the West before in the years leading up to World War III. Then in the next phase, when you get closer to the war, is a period where the KGB, which has been collecting dirt on everybody in the West, all the players in the West, the business people, the media people, the Hollywood people, the political people, suddenly the KGB starts pouring out that dirt, starts opening its files, exposing scandal after scandal after scandal in the military, in the churches, in everywhere. And this scandal phase is very important because it serves the purpose of demoralizing Western society, disrupting it, but they can also plant stories, making it look like some of our leaders are their agents. Because what would be better before a war than to convince the American people that their president is compromised by the Russians and has been working as a Russian stooge, right? Does this sound familiar at all?
It sounds like the news of today.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at this attempt for the past year to paint the U.S. president as a Russian agent, by the way, where does this story that he's a Russian agent come from? It comes from Russia. Who concocted that Mr. Steele's dossier the Golden Shower dossier, so-called, that came out of Moscow. Mr. Steele went and gave it to those people working for the Democratic Party, that intelligence outfit that the Democrats hired.
Right.
I tell you, the Russian KGB concocted that file. And what Suvorov says is they're going to release legitimate material on people, but they're also going to concoct fake dossiers that they're going to try to put over. And of course, what's alarming is the way that Gray Terror, the way that now the scandal phase that Suvorov talked about, the way that all the things that Golitsyn, with his probably now 96% accuracy of predicting what the collapse of the Soviet Union meant. He said the collapse of the Soviet Union was a fake collapse of communism done to disarm the West so they could come back later with a rearmament, catch us, unawares, and create this united alliance with China where they would smash the West, smash the United States, and control the world. This is all in Golitsyn's 1984 book called New Lies for Old. Golitsyn was a KGB defector. He was involved in the early planning stages of what's called the Soviet long-range strategy, which was concocted in the late 50s and then officially adopted in 1960, which is what all this is. It took them. This is such a complicated maneuver that they, collapsing communism, that it took them 30 years to prepare the structures within their own society so that the Communist Party Soviet Union could go underground and everything would function, the Soviets would still control, and that we would believe that because of the supposed giving up of these countries in Eastern Europe, the loss of the Baltic states and Poland and some of the other countries, that they had basically lost. But you see, what does the Hungarian or the Polish army amount to when you've got strategic nuclear supremacy? Those things don't matter in terms of real strategic weaponry and the balance of power.
Jeff, address the operational objectives of Spetsnaz, Russian Special Forces, during the final part of the overture period, the pre-war period, in which they, according to Suvorov, would be engaged in industrial sabotage, creating a series of accidents that would appear as accidents, which in fact would be sabotage activities, such as derailment of a train in Seattle, the power going out at a major airport in the U.S., a pipeline exploding, and a major leak, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Or all of the German U-boats now in Germany as a NATO country, all their U-boats being out of service at one time, which is right in the news now.
That's a very good point. Or a bioweapon being released in all the major Navy ports, such that within months, half of the Navy personnel are sick, and half of the U.S. Navy essentially is now no longer on the ocean.
Yeah, that's a good. You've outlined it very well. You've basically outlined these are operations that are engaged in sabotage and terrorist operations immediately before World War III. I'll tell you what Colonel Stanislav Lunev told me when I was discussing this subject with him in 1998, in November of '98. I was saying to him, I've read the literature, the Soviet literature on nuclear war, and I understand in principle you can actually gain such a level of surprise that you can destroy your enemy by various tactics. But I could not imagine specifically the trick to make a nuclear attack successful. I knew there were tricks, but I couldn't imagine what the trick was. I couldn't quite, come up with it. And he basically said it's easy. He said if you ever hear that an American city is attacked with a nuclear weapon by Arab terrorists, don't believe it. And I said, well, why wouldn't I believe it? He said, because it will be my people, it will be Spetsnaz, it will be the Russians that are doing it. But they want you to think that it's from, Muslim or Arab terrorists. And of course, that has been put in our minds since 9/11. That was as soon as 9/11 happened. Bin Laden's got the bomb. We heard this from a number of people. I know they're trying to smuggle a bomb into Manhattan. That's the next thing. So that we were being prepped for this.
Scare.
And the anthrax scare, absolutely, and the way the FBI mishandled that kind of proved we were unready and unable to cope with and when you look at the way the FBI and the CIA have behaved toward our new president, you realize that they've been heavily penetrated. And there's even, I've seen, I don't know if it's true, there's even people that claim that the NSA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, are basically in a kind of war with the CIA and FBI in the sense that they realize there's bad actors there in the CIA and the FBI. And, I don't know what it's so confusing, but there's some really alarming news about the behavior of the FBI that we've seen in recent months. The way they've been working to damage the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, damaging the country.
Well,
the CIA lying about these. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you look at the history of the CIA and the FBI, it's unbelievable to the average American because we're never told any of this in the history school, in our history classes, in the news, or in any documentary. But the level of infiltration and subversion that occurred in the CIA from the beginning is to the point where the agency was completely frustrated right out of the get-go and has basically lost every battle with the KGB on every single platform since the agency was created. I mean, our intelligence agencies are a disaster. They have been infiltrated, subverted, and they've been on a wild goose chase for 75 years.
Well, the CIA is a good example. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was Joseph Trento who did a bunch of interviews with James Angleton before Angleton's death, and he claimed that Angleton had a deathbed confession. I don't know if it's true. James Angleton was a longtime head of the CIA counterintelligence staff, and he was very concerned about how penetrated the CIA was by the KGB, and this is going back into the 60s. James Angleton believed that the penetrations were multiple and they were near the top of the agency. And one of the things that Trento alleges, which is really I've been looking into, is that the CIA had interactions at the end of World War II, mainly Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA in the 50s, when his brother John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State. Allen Dulles worked out of Switzerland, and there were negotiations with the SS generals around Himmler. And the SS controlled a lot of wealth, a lot of gold. And there was gold deposited near the Swiss border by the SS, and there were stories about CIA personnel collecting that gold without it being accounted for as it was supposed to with all the other gold that the Allied forces were collecting from from the conquest of Germany in 1945. And you see, one of the problems is that the Germans got penetrated by the Soviets toward from 1943 on. It was rife. We know this from the head of SS Foreign Intelligence, Walter Schellenberg's memoirs, that Schellenberg was in a fight for his life against Soviet moles within the Nazi establishment, that there was basically a war going on within Nazi Germany before the war ended because many Nazi officials knew that the Soviet Union after the Battle of Stalingrad was going to win the war, and they'd already made their own secret deal with the communists before the war was over. And so the game began then to compromise the Americans. And what Trento's claim is that when these CIA guys got dirty, basically did something corrupt with Nazi gold or whatever the detail of the allegations might be, the other details, the Soviets knew about it. So that the Russians were in a position, and all these guys became sort of the founding leaders of the OSS was what the CIA was in World War II. These guys became the founders of the CIA. These guys were dirty, according to Trento, and I guess he claims that Angleton basically confessed to him that he knew that when he took the job as head of CIA counterintelligence, the condition was he would not polygraph any of these guys, and he would not ask him any questions about this part of the war. What they did at the end of World War II. how any of this went down. And if that's true, Angleton, I guess, expressed to Trento the fear that these guys then were vulnerable to recruitment by the KGB.
Of course.
Because they had done something dirty, right? And the KGB, if they knew about it, they could blackmail them with it. And this is the head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, he's talking about. So if that's true, if the CIA leadership were a bunch of corrupt OSS officers who got their fingers dirty on Nazi gold at the end of the war, and the Russians knew it and had them blackmailed over it, what would that make the CIA? And Angleton could not polygraph any of them?
Right.
Well,
the same way they protected Kissinger, who they knew, Angleton knew Kissinger, or had reason to believe Kissinger was a double agent for the Soviets, but yet he was protected by the White House for years.
Well, yeah, Nixon protected Kissinger. And, well, you should point out that Henry Kissinger was accused of being an agent of the Soviet GRU by one of the top British spies in Polish military intelligence. It's in a Warsaw Pact country military intelligence. Codename Sniper Michael Golanowski was a British double agent working inside Polish military intelligence who had seen a list of Soviet agents recruited in 1945 in Germany, in occupied Germany. That list included, according to Golanowski, Sergeant Henry Kissinger.
Right.
That's what he claimed. And, of course, nobody wanted to touch this with a 10-foot pole, but there were others who came to suspect Kissinger over the years, including one of Angleton's successors, it's in the book Widows. They have he wanted Kissinger. He was a counterintelligence official who claimed that Kissinger had given away a major spy that we had in Moscow.
Yeah, after meeting in the Soviet embassy, the man was dead within hours.
This CIA official's name was Leonard McCoy, like the character in Star Trek. He was extremely upset at what had happened, and he believed that Kissinger had given away the spy. But there's a lot of things in Kissinger's background that point to him having been an agent. Not only that he pushed Nixon into detente, into the ABM treaty, into all kinds of treaties with the Soviet Union, the strategic arms, the first SALT treaty, and also this peace treaty in Vietnam that ended up causing Vietnam to become conquered by the communists. All the disasters of the 1970s can be laid at Kissinger's door.
Absolutely.
He was involved in all disastrous treaties and disastrous agreements, and the opening of China, which is now our greatest disaster, because look at this trade deficit with China. China has ruined our industrial economy.
Right.
They've destroyed it. They have prosecuted a trade war on us that has harmed us, and really, ultimately, this was the brainchild of Kissinger. Kissinger enabled all that.
And through that trade war, Jeff, they acquired the resources to build the modern army that they're going to use to fight us. In the time that we have left, which is about 15 minutes, paint a picture for our listeners who understand the threat of World War III, the riding of the red horse of the Book of Revelation. Let's paint a picture of how does this begin, and how fast is it over once the war starts? What would be a reasonable scenario for the commencement of World War III? How will they play the cards?
It looks like, you had the statement of the Marine Corps general here more than a week ago to the troops in Norway about, there's a big war coming. And so you have Europe, and NATO is threatened. You had the Russian West exercise, the Zapad exercise, early last September. It turns out we now know that was a drill preparing for an invasion of Europe. They were going to invade Scandinavia, Poland, the Baltic states, and they were going to bomb Amsterdam and Germany. This was part of the drill. This has been in the news if you missed it. So that is a hot spot because the Russians are claiming that they have the right to put back together the Soviet Union. You know, they've already annexed Crimea, and they're fighting in Ukraine, but they could easily flip that over. I would be very suspicious of the Ukrainian government, which I think has already been, is basically taken over from the inside. The Ukrainian people are the problem. They don't quite know how to handle that. Ukrainian people want to be free, and that's a long-term political problem for Moscow. But that's a general hotspot area there. I mean, it's massive, and the Russians have been building their armies, their nukes, their missiles for the purpose of either intimidating Europe or outrightly invading it. Then you have the Middle East. The Russians are in Syria. They're able to project military power all the way into Iraq. They're allied with Iran. The leaders of Iran were all trained in the Soviet Union. They went to Moscow State University, and this is including the Ayatollah himself. This is basically a Russian puppet state. You have the threat to the Saudi oil fields from Iran. You've got the Persian Gulf. Iran has been arming to the teeth. Obama gave them a break so that, they promised not to build a nuclear weapon and we don't embargo them. Well, I'm sure they've been building a nuclear weapon, and just like the North Koreans did when we had a similar deal with them back in the 90s. Then you have, of course, the Korea, talking about the next theater. You've got North Korea threatening the nations of the Pacific with nuclear weapons, testing ICBMs that work, and possessing, maybe as many as 30 nuclear weapons. Seriously, the U.S. government considering a preemptive strike to destroy the nuclear missile capacity of North Korea, which would probably begin World War III. It looks like the Russians and the Chinese are lining up behind North Korea and saying, if you attack North Korea, we're going to defend North Korea. And I believe they would. I believe that would be the beginning of World War III. And I think that's the most likely place for it to start. A Chinese general recently said, expect war by the end of winter. Mm-hmm. I think he said either beginning or late March. I'd have to go back and look at the quote. That war in Korea is going to begin then, so get ready. The Russians have been flying air missions over North Korea, showing their support for the North Koreans. The Russians have evacuated the civilian population from the border areas of Russia near North Korea, and they have put all kinds of missile weapons in there. The Chinese have been moving divisions up to the Korean border, setting up refugee camps.
They're getting ready.
It looks like there's going to be. Yeah, it looks like they're getting ready, and so. If we can take these statements of the Russian and the Chinese officials seriously, I would expect the war to begin sometime during the winter with some kind of U.S. preemptive strike against the North Korean nuclear sites and missile sites, in which a general war begins to erupt after that, in which China and Russia intervene. And if they can sink a U.S. carrier, if they can defeat us militarily, which you're talking about 3 very well-armed communist countries against the United States, South Korea, and Japan, I'm not sure we would be able to prevail under those conditions.
Well, and our supply lines are very long, and theirs are very short.
Jeff, I got a question for you about North Korea, and actually I have 2 questions. And the first one is, you're talking about that Russia and China said they would get behind them. But is North Korea kind of like this wild card that they're just like, you know what, we'll back them, or do you think North Korea is really actually a strategy of theirs?
It's a strategy of theirs.
Okay.
I'm in private. Intelligence people have told me that that's their opinion too. Some of them. Yes, this is obviously. Look, North Korea gets its fuel from China. They couldn't run for a week without the Chinese giving them fuel. You think that they're not doing this, with the Chinese telling them to?
Or at least agreeing and nodding their approval. Absolutely.
There's no, you see, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, the original communist dictator of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, was a Soviet military officer who was sent by Stalin to take charge of that country. The North Korean army is just an extension of the Soviet army or the Russian army. I mean, they have Russian military advisors, they have Chinese conventional weapons, and Russian nuclear and missile weapons. They wouldn't have, and none of that. They've been built up by Russia and China together as a joint project of Russia and China. 3 years ago, the Russians doubled the number of rail tracks running across the Russian border into North Korea. Why did they do that? And they added military advisors to North Korea. Why did they do that?
Rapid
you think they're not
response
behind
war
this?
begins.
Yeah.
Well, it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
The other thing is that they are. Yeah.
The other thing is about their development of nuclear weapons. We have been told by sources in Russia, they've had in-camera testimony to Congress about it, that Russian scientists have been helping them build these bombs, these nuclear weapons that they're building, including the people who built the super EMP weapon for the Soviet Union are building that weapon, have been working on that weapon for North Korea, which is the weapon which could kill 300 million Americans if they manage to get it over the middle of our country. And a super EMP weapon would knock out every piece of electric equipment in this country, every computer, every transformer, every power, the whole power grid gone, and we wouldn't be able to get that power back up for 10 to 13 months, and that would cause total societal breakdown. The food supply would immediately cease to be available, and it would revert to cannibalism fairly fast. And 80%, one figure they came up with was 90% could be killed as a result of one bomb, one super EMP bomb over the U.S. That's how, and that's just wiping out because we're so dependent on electric power.
And we are also not defended at all against an EMP.
No, and that's actually something that's biblical. The Bible says that the city that went out by 1,000 will go out by 100, and the city that went out by 100 should go out by 10. Basically a tie, 10% left. One other question I had real quick, Jeff, for you. It's something I've been thinking of through the years. We kind of forget about it, but the lost Russian nuclear suitcases. I've heard, maybe 100 of them supposedly lost or planted. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're hard to keep up because of the triggers. My thought is that we could maybe shoot down some missiles. The threat that could already be within our borders really wouldn't matter if those are a real threat still to this day as those Russian nuclear suitcases if they were planted around our country.
Yeah, Lunev was the guy that gave the congressional testimony. My friend Colonel Lunev gave the testimony on that because what he did is he showed the congressman places. One of the things he did was responsible for scouting possible sites for hiding satchel nuclear warheads in the United States. The story is that in advance of a war, the Russians would smuggle nuclear weapons inside the United States to be used and this is the business of, if nukes go off in our cities, we'll think what? That ISIS did it, right? And especially if ISIS goes and takes credit for it. But it will be these Russian... Yeah, the Russians will have smuggled them in. The Russians have been smuggling nuclear weapons into the country for a long time. In fact, it was revealed many years ago, a journalist who had lunch with President Kennedy revealed how he was shocked at this lunch with President Kennedy back in, I think it was in 1961, if I remember the story correctly, that this President Kennedy told him, he said, that he had just found out that the Russians had a nuclear bomb in Washington, a very large hydrogen bomb. And he was shocked. He says, well, how could they do that? He said, they brought it in pieces through diplomatic pouches into the Soviet embassy, and they built it, and I think he said it was in the attic of the Soviet embassy. And so the Soviet embassy had a nuclear weapon in it. So that they could actually bomb Washington by just simply pushing a button in the Soviet embassy and blowing Washington off the map. They didn't need to send a missile. And it was like Kennedy was kind of baffled, like, what do you do with that? What do you do with people who are that crazy?
Well, if you're the United States, you open your border with Mexico, and you let whoever wants to walk right in, come right in.
And of course,
when you look at our policy, Jeff, you've done a great job highlighting the threat, the reality of the threat, and the fact that this has been coming and has been in planning and has been in motion for many, many years. In the face of this, our leaders left the borders wide open. But when we do go to the airport, we have to take our shoes off. That will clearly accomplish nothing. It's a PSYOP show. It's a security theater for the American people. And, of course, those TSA people have accomplished nothing. They've stopped nothing. But the real threat is actually coming into the country, and it's astonishing that in the midst of all this, essentially the planning for the destruction of our country, our political leaders have done nothing other than put their head in the sand.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I asked Luna, how do they bring weapons of mass destruction into the country before a full-blown war? And he said, through the same routes that the drugs enter your country, the illegal narcotics.
Yeah, they fly them in, they bury them in.
If you read the Los Angeles Times, the Los Angeles Times reporting says that the Mexican mafia is controlled by the Russian mafia. This has been known for years. The Mexican mafia is the Mexican branch of the Russian mafia. So it is basically what it is. And Russia has been involved in cocaine trafficking and heroin trafficking for many years. The movie The French Connection was about heroin coming from Corsica, I believe, into France. Well, the Corsican mafia was one of the first mafias to align itself with the KGB. And where was the poppies were grown in Central Asia or Afghanistan, and they were moved, to Bulgaria, where a company called Kintax, controlled by the Soviets and the Bulgarians, produced synthesized the heroin and then shipped it into Europe. I mean, drugs became a major business, and infiltrating organized crime was very important for the KGB to get political intelligence and blackmail on politicians, intelligence officers, and police.
And they were very good at it, too.
Yeah, they were very good at it. And, of course, I don't want to paint the Russians as supermen because they do make a lot of bungles. We would already be taken over by them if they didn't also have major bungles. But the way we're playing the game, we're not even playing it right now. And people have to wake up. They have an enemy.
We have an enemy. And denying the threat doesn't protect us for even 1 minute. Jeff, let's roll forward in the scenario. War has occurred in Korea at the end of winter, and we've moved some of our military assets to fight a ground war, a land war in Korea, circle forward through summer to some point August, September, and actual attack on the mainland of the United States occurs using nuclear weapons, cruise missiles from submarines, satchel bombs from Spetsnaz commandos, massive sabotage, disruptions of telecommunications, satellite uplinks, the TVs, the phones, the radios. None of this is working, and the ICBMs fly. We have a space detonation of X-rays that blind NORAD. There's been ground detonations. We are told it's the Arab terrorists again. And in the span of, 15 minutes, all of our military assets are vaporized in this country, something like that?
A nuclear disarming strike, which catches us off guard. People don't realize the kind of weapons that exist now can blind satellites and sensors, can make it so that even if you're in doubt for 5 minutes, that 5 minutes a cruise missile could be headed right to your headquarters building, could be headed right into your missile silo or your air base and destroy your bombers, destroy your nuclear missiles, destroy your nuclear weapons stockpile before you get a chance to use it. And this is the art of surprise attack. If you read Soviet textbooks about nuclear war, the Soviet textbook would say something like, the best defense for a nuclear weapon is to fire it first. The best way to destroy a nuclear weapon is before it's been fired. So, and then with their strong ABM defense system, any weapons that we do manage to launch in the chaos of those minutes would be interceptable because their infrastructure would be intact, ours would be in shambles, our attacks would not be fully coordinated, would not be as effective. And of course, with simultaneous wars breaking out in the Far East, in the Middle East, and possibly in Eastern Europe, they would have us you know, in a complete situation where we weren't able to manage the conflicts that we were already in, and that we would be, you know, all your military people are focused on if it's a ground war in Korea, if it's an attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz by Iran, or an invasion of the Saudi oil fields by Iran, or something happening in Syria and Jordan, or in Ukraine, or the Baltic states. If all these things go up at once, or any number of them, you know, the United States is going to have its hands full. And each one of these things can serve as a diversion in advance of a strategic attack. And plus, if we're fighting Iran or North Korea, we get hit with a nuke, who are we going to think did it? North Korea, Iran, not Russia. It's not who we're going to think first. In fact, we might, if we do have a retaliation, we might retaliate against the wrong country.
Right.
Which would be fine with the Russians, I'm sure.
Once the nuclear attack that is going to basically destroy all of our major military assets, once those ICBMs have flown, the next day, population centers perhaps have not been attacked directly. How quickly do we face a ground invasion? How quickly are commando forces being airdropped into Central Valley in Northern California? How fast will the Chinese transport ships begin dropping Chinese troops in the ports of Southern California? How fast will we have a war on our mainland?
In the 1980s, and if you read the Soviet military doctrine then, it was immediately. As soon as the nuclear bombs are landing, you want to be landing troops. And basically, 6,000 to 7,000 Spetsnaz commandos would already be deployed to the United States before they even launched their attack. They would come here in civilian clothing, sort of like the Brandenburg Regiment did in Norway. Okay, you had a bunch of Germans arriving in civilian clothing in neutral Norway, and they went to places where they picked up their weapons and their uniforms, and there they were. So you pre-position troops in the country. I mean, this would be relatively easy to do in the United States. Then you grab airports and port facilities, and then you can start bringing troops in by air immediately, that very day that the war begins. This is the ideal situation. Of course, China, with its operating of many ports in Mexico and the United States, China could have, you know, there's all these Chinese freighters coming into the West Coast all the time, and even in the Gulf Coast. You could have these freighters loaded with troops and heavy weapons, and who would know that they were? And they could be offloading those troops and heavy weapons the very day the war begins. And
yeah, and who's going to stop them? The LA County Sheriff's Office?
Not really. You know, look, the Chinese together with Hong Kong have the largest merchant marine in the world. They could move a incredible amount of equipment and troops, and the Chinese Army is the largest army in the world.
Well, and we wouldn't realize that they were offloading military assets, offensive forces that would immediately go into action until the troops literally began to come out of the port. And who's going to be there to stop them? The highway patrol?
Right. Well, if Norway is an example, look, the German operation in Norway, which was brilliantly conceived and executed, and obviously Norway is a much smaller country than the United States, but we're talking about China and Russia here, the largest country, the most populous country in the world together. So it really is conceivable that you can do an operation like this. I believe if you look at the way the Chinese are operating ports, you know, in Mexico and the U.S. There are stories out of Mexico. There was the silent invasion, and I knew the author. I think he's passed away, but he was
Gulbrandsen or something like that.
Gulbrandsen, Scott Gulbrandsen.
Thank you.
He wrote The Silent Invasion, and I know Scott. I've spent a lot of time on the phone with him. I read his book. I appreciate his sincerity. Scott was a reporter for the major San Diego newspaper there, and he spent a lot of time in Tijuana. And he discovered sources telling him that the Chinese were offloading and secretly stockpiling military equipment in Mexico. Now, this is the exact kind of thing I'm talking about. So, and Scott isn't the only one that's collected some of this information.
Right.
You'll find that other people have talked about. In fact, in earlier decades, the Russians had secretly stockpiled some military equipment in Mexico. there was stories in the in different parts of the U.S. media about these very secretive Mexican-Chinese naval convoys going to Baja, not knowing, was it drugs they were shipping into Mexico, or was it heroin or something, or was it weapons?
Right.
We don't know. But Gulbranson had gathered a lot of information on this, and he had talked to witnesses, fishermen at the port of Ensenada, for example. A
large
Tijuana
number
police
of
officer
witnesses came forward.
Yeah,
I've actually got the book on my desk. It's a pretty interesting read. He basically says you have to ask the question, why are Cuban and Korean soldiers armed with Chinese weapons in northern Mexico probing the U.S. border?
Camped out in the desert out in Mexico, yes.
And why is Mexico allowing this, and how could it be that the U.S. does not know?
Well, again, there's a lot of things we don't want to know. And
exactly.
There's a mentality in this country. I mean, look, I know what most people are going to say. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've been following this. I kind of caught on to what was going to happen. That's what I started writing my first book in 1987 when I started to realize what the defector literature was indicating. And I thought, my gosh, we're too stupid. We're not watching this. And it has unfolded, sad to say, very much like I kind of expected. And you can't, and of course, what I didn't understand in the late 80s was that nobody was going to wake up. You could point to the books, you could say, look, this guy said it right here, and here's happening. They don't care. They don't want to know. And the higher up you get, whether it's William F. Buckley, who laughed and mocked this material in 1991 when somebody brought up that Golitsyn had predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, the defector, all the way to President George W. Bush calling it conspiracy theory, or George H.W. Bush calling it conspiracy theory when somebody said that the August coup was a fake, and that person was the president of Georgia, by the way.
Right.
A Soviet country said that the coup was a fake. And George H.W. Bush on public television said that it was some kind of a conspiracy theorist. He's some kind of lunatic. No, this guy is a former Communist Party official. He's telling you what he knows. The West just ignored all the clues and all the evidence, and now it's just so glaringly obvious. I mean, people could give me a rational argument that I was wrong for most of the last 30 years. But not since 2014.
No.
Since 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, with the Russian military buildup becoming publicly known and beginning to be able to notice it, when these things are starting to be tracked in undeniable ways, and now with these other signs, with what we saw with Bush being accused of being a Russian spy or Russian stooge, with this fake dossier. And being accused,
Trump?
by the way, Trump being accused. Yeah, Trump being accused with people like Obama and Hillary Clinton, who've always been flacking for the Russians and the communists, being his accuser. Now, this is really outrageous. I mean, if you don't smell a rat,
is accusing the American patriot of being a Russian spy.
If you don't smell a rat with that, I mean, I'm not making a pro-Trump statement or anything, but let's face it, this stuff is you've had a year and it's bogus.
Well, at the highest levels of our government, within our media, within the leadership of all the different institutions in our country, nobody wants to accept that the United States actually has enemies and that those enemies might actually do something to harm the interests of the United States at some point. No, we just want to assume that we can continue to be the world's economic and military superpower, and the rest of the world will continue to labor for us in their sweatshops and in their slave factories, and they're going to continue to sell all of their goods to us in exchange for more printed U.S. currency, which we export, and then they recycle into purchasing our federal debt, which basically means China and the rest of the BRIC nations are financing the U.S. trade deficit, the U.S. fiscal deficit, and ultimately the U.S. military budget. And, they want to believe that China will continue to pay for our F-35 fighters, which is absurd.
Yeah.
They're not going to continue.
Course,
matter of fact, they're about to stop, based on my read of all the economic tea leaves, they're going to stop this summer. And the war is most likely, my opinion, in the fall, which comprises the 70-year anniversary of Israel in captivity spiritually and the 70-year rule of the U.S. as the daughter of Babylon. But that's an opinion, we shall see. But clearly the tea leaves are confirming the world is moving towards world war. That is not a hysterical statement. That is a fact today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would tend to think this is not some wild speculation. We're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of military movement now, and very serious people making very serious statements in NATO, in Russia, in China, in the Far East. Yeah. No, and of course
war begins in Korea, Jeff, in the end of winter. Then what do you assess the probability of global war by the fall?
Well, first of all, the reason I think that these provocations by North Korea are happening is that they want us to strike first.
Clearly.
Because as Bismarck, the great German statesman, said from the 1870s, he said, never launch a preemptive war, because you are then morally responsible for all the killing and all the loss of life and loss of property that occurs in a war. Wars are terrible. They're terrible things. You must never be the one who's morally responsible for starting it. And that's why he was, in principle, against preemptive war. And I think he's right. This is one of the most far-seeing statesmen of modern history. And I think the other reason is that when you start a war, the other side feels morally justified. And the Russian and Chinese propaganda that America is a imperialist bully will then be verified to the Russian and Chinese people. And they can justify going to war on that basis. When the Russian and Chinese people, they want peace. They're normal people like Americans. They don't want to be at war with us. We don't want to be at war with them. But if our leaders start it because they've been provoked, see? So my advice to President Trump, if I may be so bold, is don't attack North Korea. Defend America. Build real missile defenses. Build the kind of weapons that can protect South Korea and China and the United States against that guy, because defense is what we need, not a preemptive attack that puts us in the wrong, which the Russians and Chinese may be fishing for, because that's the only way they can get their people to go along with a war against us. We do not want to make war a political possibility for their leaders.
Well, isn't it true, Jeff, that the Russian media, the Russian internal propaganda for the last 4 years has been telling the Russian people that the United States, along with the NATO alliance, has been surrounding Russia with military assets and ultimately intends to attack and destroy Russia as a world power. And the Russian people fear an attack from America.
That is standard Russian propaganda you hear on Russian radio and television all the time since 2014. That propaganda began around April of 2014.
But that's a necessary precursor to the actual war, because they've got to convince the public that the Russian military is going to act defensively in protecting Russia against the aggressive American imperialists.
Yes. In fact, it's textbook right out of a book called Soviet Military Strategy, which was edited by the great Soviet military strategist Vidi Sokolovsky. Sokolovsky's book states that the most important thing in a war is preparation of the people. And preparation of the people, you have to make it clear who the enemy is, why the enemy is your enemy, and what they've done to deserve what you need to do to them. And that's what the Russians have been doing now for the last 3.5 years. They have been preparing their population for war with us in terms of the messages, the indoctrination, the media messages they've been giving.
What a harsh, stark reality we face.
Yeah, and of course your summary shows how ridiculous, in terms of our financial, military, political management we have been. I mean, it is the irresponsibility of people who take for granted their wealth and their military superiority. You can't take that stuff for granted. If you do, you're gonna suffer
laughable because the wealth is predicated on debt. The military superiority, as you mentioned, the air fleet, the bombers are 60 years old. Even the fighters, the F-16s, the F-18s, the F-15s, that's all 30-plus-year-old equipment, and it's been operated pretty much nonstop. The only really new assets we have are the new, I guess they're the Ford-class aircraft carriers that they're coming out with, and those are functionally obsolete in the face of hypersonic missiles. So, I find it interesting, Jeff.
That may be true. Yeah, that may be true.
I'm certain that it's true. When we have, maybe one hypersonic missile could be stopped, but if there's 10 or 20 of them being shot at the carrier, there's no way to stop them all. And, I find it fascinating.
Let me tell you, they can stop 20 or 30. You got to hit them with hundreds. But the Chinese have hundreds that they can hit them
fine.
with.
They've got the sufficient number. But what's really fascinating is if you look at the course of human history, when a ruling power was at the end of its tenure as the superpower, its military platform through which it ruled the world became obsoleted by changes in technology. For example, Britain, which ruled the seas for several hundred years and was the empire that basically expired or extinguished was in World War II, relied on the battleship as the principal projection of military power. World War II brought the advent of the aircraft carrier and the obsolescence of the battleship. Nobody builds battleships anymore. They're gone. And so America and the American empire projected its power. The American Eagle flew off the carrier. But now you've got new technologies, these hypersonic missiles that travel at 6,000 miles an hour, and they're a lot cheaper to build a hypersonic missile than they are an aircraft carrier. They have effectively obsoleted the carriers. And so, as the American empire is about to fall, so too its primary military asset has become functionally obsolete.
Well, guys, we're coming down to about the end of time here on this program, and I appreciate everything you've shared with us, but I've got something. We just can't leave it like this because you're going to have the listeners here, Jeff and Benjamin, that this information is disturbing. I've got a family. What do I do? My reality could change quickly. What would you say right now to the listener that's hearing this information and their first thoughts are maybe a fear of what do I do, knowing that at any moment here, and very shortly, most likely, that things are going to change in this country forever. What would your advice to them?
Well, my advice is, of course, I think people should have extra food and water stored in their homes because these basic necessities. You may need it to tide you over if there is a military emergency, and we kind of assume that that's never going to happen, but it can. The other thing is that knowledge of who the enemy is and what they're doing, and that this is very important as basic orientation, because our political leaders, the right political leaders, need to be supported in the right way by an informed public who says, you need to build new weapons, you need to be responsible, we need to secure the border, we need to find out what the Russians and the Chinese are up to here. We need to avoid launching any reckless preemptive attacks when we're in a state of military inferiority versus this other block of countries. This kind of thing. We need to have more of a debate and more of a reasoned. People have to educate themselves about this and understand that I'm talking about these books I'm talking about are easily accessible, and the information is not. I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory. I'm talking about stuff that's been published and talked about for years. But it's just people, for some reason, they've just neglected learning this material or wanting to be interested in it because maybe it's not titillating enough. I don't know. But we need to take our citizenship seriously, and we need to be oriented as a people in a country, and we need to be united as a people and not allow, because part of their game is to divide us against our own people.
Which they've done an excellent job of. And I would add to that, Jeff, and those are good comments, and absolutely people should be prepared for changes to come suddenly. But I would also add that the events that we are looking at are actually part of Bible prophecy, and this world war that is coming sooner or later is actually the riding of the red horse of war that will precede the rise of the Antichrist kingdom. And the destruction of America, Babylon, the destruction of our nation in this war is clearly laid out in Bible prophecy. This is an event that the Lord is actually doing, and it cannot be stopped, but we need to be the people of faith who respond by prayer, by seeking God, and by diligently getting our house and our heart in order. And as Jeff pointed out, also arming ourselves. The Scripture says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. There is nothing good about being stupid or ignorant or simply unaware. And Americans, to a great extent, know more about Dancing with the Stars, and they know more about who won the Voice this year than they do about the real world in which we live. And, that's just all part of the deception that has pretty much sealed our fate. But for the remnant, and there is a remnant that's going to survive and endure these things, equip yourself with knowledge. And, Jeff's website, jrnyquist.com, has some excellent material. You can go to my website, benjaminbaruch.net. I would encourage you, if you've been blessed by the message tonight and by the work that either Jeff or I have done, get a copy of the New Tactics of Global War. And after you've read it, and it'll bring you up to speed on the things you can look for that will be happening in the real world as the world gets closer and closer to the outright imminent hostilities beginning, you'll be able to recognize, okay, the war is within a week or two, and make your final preparations. Fill your bathtub with water. Do things like that. But you can also take this book and give it to the naysayers in your family or your friends who simply can't accept the message of warning based on Bible prophecy. Well, this is a message of warning based on a candid, clear military assessment. I am a former military analyst. I was trained as an order of battle specialist to study and monitor the Soviet military and to recognize their preparations for war. Jeff is one of the probably smartest military analysts who's got the eyes who see the reality and not colored by rose-colored glasses. We've done all we can to bring this information to you to protect you and your household, but you've got to do your part too. This is not an entertainment program. We are giving you this information to try to save your life and to save the lives of your children and of your family and of your friends. And if we can get this information out widespread enough, the more American lives we can save, the better the outcome for all of us in the aftermath of this war that, in my personal opinion, is absolutely unstoppable. It's only a question of when. And right now, when is looking fairly highly like the fall of 2018, in my personal opinion. But as Jeff said, it might delay until 2019 or perhaps even 2020. This war is coming. This is not 10 years off. This is in our face. And I don't know if any of you guys feel the same as me, but 2017 pretty much occurred in the blink of an eye. And we're knocking on the door of 2018, folks. It's New Year's Eve in a couple days from when we recorded this program. You probably will be listening to this in 2018. So, take heed how you hear. Be a Berean, do the homework, and get a copy of the book, The New Tactics of Global War. It'll definitely arm you with the information you need to provide a warning to your friends and your family. And with that, I would say God bless you, and be praying, because this thing is real and it's coming.
Amen. Folks, the Bible says, a prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Simply said, if you see it coming, do something about it. Don't just sit around idle. Seek the Lord, make your spiritual preparations, and make some physical preparations. It's not unbiblical to do that. Folks, buy the book, find out, be aware of what's going on. Jeff and Benjamin, thank you for taking your time to come on the Remnant Call, and may God bless each one of you and protect you as we face what's coming upon our nation in soon days, it looks like, ahead. So with that, I will say thank you to everybody. This is Brother Frank and Benjamin and Jeff with the Remnant Call saying good night and shalom.